I want to welcome you to our monthly webinar that Waypoint hosts called the Waypoint 55, which is a webinar in 55 minutes or less on a ministry related topic. And it's specifically targeted for, though not exclusively attended by, lay leaders in the church, not for staff, although we often have many staff that are on our webinars. This webinar series is now 4 years old. We've last month was our 4-year anniversary, so we've got 48 editions in the tank, and um, and uh, this year we are paying special attention, special focus on pastor care. Our staff, Waypoint staff, uh, had our staff retreat in early January, and I used to be a high school soccer official, and whenever you re-upped your certification every January, you'd go to your training and they talk about, well, here's the point of emphasis for the year. And there would be a few things, whether it's basketball or soccer or whatever, that they really focus on for that year, whether it's hand checking or offsides, whatever it is. And this year, our point of emphasis as a staff, as an organization, is pastor care, even though it's something that we do every year because of the lingering effects of the pandemic that we are still in. Lord willing, we are on the back end of it, but we don't know exactly where we're at on that. We feel like the season of ministry that's ahead from September 15 to next Easter is going to be one of the potentially the biggest ministry opportunities that we have in our ministry careers as pastors. But the pastorate at large is just worn out. They are whooped from the last year of doing ministry in a new way, in a different rhythm, in a different out of their comfort zone. And so we feel like a lot of our pastors may really miss an opportunity to lead your church as well as they can because of their satisfaction and morale in ministry. And so this year, we're hoping to do extra ways to support and serve pastors. And one of the ways that we hope to do that is by equipping the church to recognize and identify how they can be part of the solution for their pastors feeling fully engaged, fully called, fully supported to do the work that they've been called to do. Always sponsored for 4 years by our ministry partner, Mid-Atlantic Christian University in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. And they serve in the same footprint generally as we do in the Middle Atlantic. And so we're thrilled that they have been our partner and sponsored our webinar platform. And so we want to say thank you to them. I also want to let you know at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. You can hit the chat to say stuff to other attendees potentially, but there's a Q&A button which allows you to ask a question to either me or our guest speaker, our presenter tonight, Andy, about pastoring your pastor. And what I want to encourage you to do is to type it in as soon as you think of the question, not wait for a time where you might type it in later. It goes into a queue over in the side of our screen that I can read as you type it in, and then try and find the best time to ask that question, whether it's during the webinar or at the end, or even after the webinar. We get a report generated of all the questions that were asked so that we can answer them after the fact if we don't get it to it during the webinar. We've got a YouTube channel that you can go to, and all of our webinars of the last 48 months have been categorized and grouped into playlists. So if you click on the playlist button there, you'll see the ones that are for safety and security, or for elders, or for mission teams, or prayer teams, or whatever. And there will be multiple previous webinars that might equip the people at your church in those different areas of ministry that we're trying to support servant leaders at your church through. And so you can check that out. We also have a new webinar this year that we just started in January, not webinar, podcast that drops a new podcast every other week. And I say that in particular, we might not say that always on our podcast, but the last one that just came out was about pastor care and how Waypoint hopes that we are able to help your pastor through navigating through difficult times. And Neil Wheeler, who's the director of pastor care for our organization was the person that was interviewed for that. And so we've got great leaders from around the region that have been interviewed here in the last couple of months. And so we would love for you to subscribe to the Waypoint podcast through whatever podcast platform you use regularly, and then listen to great leadership conversations, church leadership conversations from people that we're our intent is not to go to leaders around the country that we don't know, but great leaders within the Waypoint network that we think are doing great stuff that would be something that a lot of people need to hear. And so we would love for you to do that, but pay particular attention to the one from that came out just last week about pastor care in particular. All right, I'm going to talk about a few other things at the end of our webinar, so we hope that you'll stay tuned to that. But I'd like to introduce our topic and our guest here this evening. The topic, if you know Waypoint, we love to serve not only churches, but leaders. And it's not just an objective of ours, but a passion and a value of ours. And everyone on our staff has a story about why that's true. For me, it goes back to the example that I got from my parents and even my in-laws. My dad was an elder in multiple churches. He was in the Air Force, and so we went to a different church every 2 or 3 years. And my dad typically became an elder within the second year. The next election cycle, he became an elder, even though he was a relatively young guy. But it wasn't about him being an elder. It was about the fact that as an elder, it was his goal to become the preacher's biggest advocate and friend, that the preacher could count on him to have his back. And I saw that lived out in a variety of ways. And then I got engaged to my wife, Lisa, a couple of years ago, 35 years ago, we got engaged. And her parents owned a Christian bookstore in Louisville, Kentucky. And her dad never worked. It seemed like that her mom was always working hard, but her dad was always off in the corner talking to a preacher. And because he wasn't a preacher, he was an elder at the church, but he was kind of this side person. He became a safe person to talk to about difficult times that preachers were having. And so he was always off in the corner. I can even envision it now, 35 years later. And if it got really serious or tearful and they wanted to be private, they would go down in the basement of this nasty old building where they kept the Sunday school curriculum bulk stuff. And so they would go down in the place that looked like only spiders would go, but they would go down there and cry and pray. And I realized that as a Bible college student, I didn't know how difficult it was for ministers to just be in ministry and the burdens that they carried. And so I saw that both from my dad and my father-in-law and our families were examples to me about the need that pastors have to be pastored. And so that's a value that I have. And then everyone on our staff has a story that's somewhat similar to that. And so there are more than 500 churches within our family of churches in our network that we have varying degrees of relationship with. But every one of those pastors we pray for and we cry with, and we try to encourage and put wind in their sails. And so that's the little bit for me. And I want to introduce to you when we said we need to do a webinar on this topic, who should we ask? Andy was the first guy we thought of. And Andy and I have gotten to know each other over the last 4 or 5 years, introduced to us by one of our church planting friends, Scott Halter, that you guys are in the same town. And so Scott's doing a great job there at Catalyst Church in Winston-Salem. But Andy, I want to introduce you and have you tell your story as a layperson. You're not, a seminary grad, been in ministry forever like me, but how you got into, what was the genesis for you starting to have a vision for what pastors need that you would have never known otherwise?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on your program tonight, Tim. I was encouraged. I spend my life encouraging other people, and I was encouraged just to be reminded that all of that background from your dad and the history and the people, personalities that you were involved with, that led you to understand how important it is to return care for your pastors. We talk about refilling the pictures of our pastors' lives in our ministry, but anyway, you're totally right. And I just think it's just like I'm listening to your story, and I didn't know that part about how you just became face to face with it from younger years. when I was growing up, you're right. I have no formal seminary education or even theological education. I When I was young, I was the go-to guy for fun and recreation in my town. All the buddies, when we would skip school, it would all be, let's go hang out with Andy and let's do something fun. And it was good, clean fun. It was activities of jumping lawnmowers into the creek and going out for sandwiches and just hangout time. Well, little did I know that years later, when I got out of school, left home, I actually ended up in the construction and real estate industry. And in 2008, you know what happened? We went through a national real estate recession, and the Lord sort of used that time to turn me from what I would consider marketplace ministry into full-time Christian service. I wasn't looking for it, but honestly, I couldn't escape it. And the genesis, as you referred to, started when there was a local pastor from my home church. He was the children's pastor there, took care of my kids when they were little. And this particular guy had 7 children, 6 girls, and 1 son. And they rarely got to do, him and his son rarely got to do guy type fun stuff. And so I just invited him over one day for a recreational time. We literally just spent about 4 or 5 hours riding around some ATVs, made a campfire, chit chat in the woods. It was unencumbered recreation time. I didn't need anything from him. I wasn't looking to lament about marriage problems or kid problems or employment problems. It was just me pouring into him as a friend. And at the end of that time, I often describe it as being overly grateful for that experience. When I saw his wife the next day in church, she was also overly grateful. And she said, you'll never know what that did for Dave. And I said, well, look, I'd love to have him come back anytime. Well, he kept calling me about it, and he kept calling and being grateful over and over. And he finally said, Andy, I really feel like the Lord wants me to help you start a ministry to do what you do for other pastors. I said, well, what is it I do exactly? Because we're just out screwing around, having some fun. And he said, well, will you at least just start praying about this with me and let's see what happens. And so there's very few things in my life that I can tell you I positively know this is what the Lord asked me to do. But this is one of those things. And little did I know that's 12 years ago now that we had that first day of recreation. And we started with literally, it was just me working out of my house, calling different pastors and taking them for 1-day retreats. In fact, the original name of our ministry was Energize Day Retreats. It was just 1-day things, and it was all recreational based. Didn't make any sense to me. I didn't understand why this is what I knew what the Lord wanted me to do, but I could not escape it. There's no other way for me to describe it. So over the years, as our ministry has grown, the Lord reveals different things. I'm a believer that when you walk in obedience and you trust and obey, the Lord makes things clear. And so now 12 years later, I understand why he's put us in this spot. You mentioned it earlier. We specialize in proactive preventive care for pastors and their families. We do that directly, but we also do things like this to help encourage the church at large, the lay leadership, on why it's so important to be reinvesting and sort of refilling the pictures of their lives. And what does that look like? And we'll talk about that some more. But I mentioned to you before the broadcast, for the 10 years that we've been doing this, I always thought that's where our ministry started, that when it was that day where we were just hanging out. But I realized there's a backstory to why that was so important. And I want to start that as the foundation to where we're going. And that backstory is there was a pastor, this same pastor that we had the fun time with his son. Well, 10 years before that, he was pastoring in a small church in the rural hills of Pennsylvania. And it was a very traditional church. Everyone that's listening or watching this webinar knows the scene. It's red brick, it's white columns, it's pews with an aisle down the center, a piano on one side, an organ on the other side. And it's Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night services, and the pastor's family is expected to be there in the front row. Well, these 6 girls and the mama and the one son, they're all sitting there with their, dresses down to the ankles, and all eyes just studying that family. Like they want to see what's going on all the time. And in the middle of all that, one of those girls that was 16 years old went to work at a pretzel store, where the kids in that pretzel store said, "We are going to corrupt you and show you all the things that you've been missing in your last 16 years. They knew that she was a PK. And that girl got pregnant. And I wish I could tell all of you that that church surrounded that family with love and grace in what, as you know, was already a very difficult time. But you know what happened? That pastor got asked to leave, was accused of not being able to care for his own family. So how can he care for the church? And I have said this line many times: the prevailing attitudes and actions of that congregation profoundly impacted the next several seasons of life for everybody in that family. And it sent those kids, I'm not telling you this is the only thing, but this was a huge piece of the puzzle, that it sent those kids running from the Lord and wanting nothing to do with the church. I knew all that as a backstory when I met this guy, and he was the children's pastor at my church. In that case, for the betterment of his family, they moved all the way to North Carolina from Pennsylvania. And he spent a couple years doing odd jobs as a painter and doing some other things until he just knew the Lord was calling him back into the pasture. And so I knew all of that, and I wanted to just be a friend to him. And it was important because for years, the kids in that family, like, they put them through so much trauma and stress, and it was just at points unbearable. And unfortunately, the eyes of the average parishioner are judgmental and self-righteous, myself included. Honestly, Tim, I mean, I'm a recovering Pharisee every day of the week, and it's easy to see and have unintended consequences become of that. And so one of the things that I want to talk about, you asked about why and how, and I want to get to that. But one of those things is the power of your words and your actions, and some people call it scuttlebutt, the rumors that come around in the church foyer. And if you're back in our day, it was the vestibule in the church, about what the pastor's kids are wearing and what they're doing, and why the wife didn't look as cordial as she usually does. I mean, all of these things, like, they're subsurface stress levels that add up, and they come back and they keep coming. And so one of the kids in this family a few years ago wrote a Facebook post that I happened to see. And this kid, who's now a 40-year-old woman, was referring to an incident that happened one Sunday afternoon. Phone call, and it's a lady in the church that says, "I can't believe your daughter had that mini skirt on, and it was showing her leg or her knee or something." And she says, "I only remember," or it started out with the somehow the skirt rose above my knee, made the boys at church lust after me, and I only remember my once in a blue moon something new as something I somehow blew. Okay, this is a 40-year-old woman that's referring to something that happened 25 years earlier, and it still sticks with her. So, you know what researchers tell you? It takes 7 compliments to overcome the effects of 1 criticism. And as you saw and know, and everybody that's watching, if you really think about it, whether you're pastor, lay pastor or not, there is way more criticism that comes into the church, unintentional. A lot of it's unintentional, but it's still negative criticism that comes, way more than there is positive. So that is the reason that Energize Ministries exists, is to combat that and to help exchange that criticism into care, and specifically preventive care, and in our case, prayer support. Now, right. I said a lot there. I'm going to go on unless you have questions about any of that.
Well, no, we're going to get into the 2 things that were the title of the webinar, is the why first and then the how second. And so I'm looking forward to you sharing the why. I get to interact with a lot of lay leaders and get to have this conversation a little bit. and hoping I can share a few things that we see. You and I have the luxury of not being a preacher in a church in one pulpit every week, and so we get to see what's going on out there, and so we get to share some of that. But from the biblical foundation, when I think about it, I think all the way back to the today's pastors are the equivalent to the Levite class in
Hmm.
the Old Testament of the 12 tribes. And if you understand the Levites, they were the ones that served the church, the tabernacle, and they existed on the generosity and the care of the other 11 tribes. The other, all of the rest of God's people took care of the Levites. And so it goes all the way back to the days of Solomon, and even before that in the tabernacle, all the way back to Moses, of God providing a way that his people would be cared for, his servants would be cared for by God's people. And in most churches, we don't have that flavor that we feel like there's some kind of adversarial relationship or judgmental relationship or a distance because the preacher must be holier than me, and so I don't want to get too close to him. And his wife must be even holier because she's married to that preacher, and all that whole idea and that separation. That ministry is a very lonely ministry, and I think lay leaders would be surprised at how many ministers talk about how lonely they are and their wife are in ministry. And that's a paradox to most lay leaders because they think we're around people all the time. It's like we're around people all the time, but at the end of the day, it's a lonely profession. And so we want to talk about that. So from your perspective, we'll cut it into two halves. Why should we even think about pastoring pastors? Then we can get into some of the practical steps in the second
Yeah.
half.
All right. So the why part, you know, you're well aware that leadership at any level invokes the criticism of some, right? It just does. It doesn't matter what kind of leadership position you're in. It always invokes criticism. When you lead in the spiritual realm, it invokes an all-out attack from our enemy. If you can't see it, and by the way, I like your background a whole lot better than my background. You look much more professional right there. So
I
congratulations.
have no plants though, so you're ahead of me on the
Yeah,
plant.
well, it's all right. I still like it, but if you
Uh,
could see the rest of my office here, there is a sword and a shield that hangs on the door to my office, and it's a reminder that we are in a spiritual battlefield every moment of every day. If you are like, this is another one of our lines. If you're effectively leading people closer to Christ, either introducing or leading people to closer to Christ, or both, then you are under a constant attack by an enemy that is a master at custom designing failure packages for anybody that's advancing the gospel message. And what does the Bible tell us? He prowls around like a roaring lion. Okay, well, if you take that imagery, and you may not see it right in front of you here, but the reality exists through kid problems, through marriage problems, through economic problems. Like what trips you up, Tim, is going to be different than what trips me up. But it is a constant, relentless pressure to derail you from doing what the Lord has asked you to do. Okay, so you have to accept that as truth and reality to understand why some of the fun and recreational things that we do to help combat that or create breaks, that's still the reason, the very serious, critical, almost unimaginable pressure that's taking place day to day to day. So that's one of the reasons why. Okay. I shared with you the passion that comes from us is because this guy, Dave Annan, was one of my best friends. And I knew firsthand the pressures that he went through. So that was a God relationship, God-given relationship that helped me understand and grow a passion for it. So, in my own home church, the lead pastor, who was a very strong advocate for our ministry, he and his wife both. Well, I don't want to say too much. I'll say it after if you can get it.
okay.
We had always been keenly aware of the spiritual warfare that rages around those in Christian service. We live continuously in this battlefield. As a family, we were suffering quietly. We didn't know who to turn to, who was strong enough to be unaffected themselves in the face of their pastor's struggles. We didn't know how to reach out for help without endangering the spiritual health of those we desperately needed to confide in. While we knew many amazing people, it was such an incredibly lonely place to be. In hindsight, I can see that we needed serious backup. We needed to be able to honestly cry out that we were under heavy attack and that we were hurting and we needed help. We needed to be able to say, look, would you just pray for us? Eventually, my husband, who loved the Lord, our God, with all his heart, lost a battle that clouded his judgment and his mind. Tragically, he took his own life. He needed consistent, powerful, and plentiful prayer from a strong and committed support network. And so did I. So did our children. And so does your pastor and his wife and his children. What Satan meant for harm, I believe, with all my heart, God will use for his good. Perhaps this is part of that good. On behalf of Energize Ministries, I'm asking for your help. Will you join me in this movement to elevate the level of care for our pastors and their families? Encourage your pastor. Go beyond the, wow, that was a great sermon, thank you. Be the voice of Christ to them and cheer them on as we run this race together. Be the one to show your pastor and his family this love. It really matters. It mattered to me, and it matters to them.
All right, so that woman is the widow of my former lead pastor, and she says a couple things in there, and it's heavy. I mean, I don't want to take away from it. It's a heavy story, but she says that they were worried about how did she say it? Affecting the spiritual health of those that they were leading, but they also needed to confide in. Okay, and I know you've heard it, Tim. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. That a pastor will say, I one time went to one of my elders or to one of my leadership team members, and that'll be the last time I go to them with one of my personal problems. And that is a dynamic that we desperately need to change. I don't want to jump ahead, but when we get to the how part, I want to recommend that one of the things that we advocate for is an annual marriage counseling program for anybody that's in spiritual leadership. Whether you need it or not, it is a great maintenance program right there, because I don't personally know anybody that is in some sort of spiritual leadership that does not have marriage problems or kid problems or some combination of both. And so rather than the expectation of, hey, our pastors should have perfect relationships, they should have perfect children that walk in step and in line with the Holy Spirit every minute of the day, we should be looking for where the troubles are and embracing that with love and grace and pouring back into them and recognizing these people are beat up. You know, she said in that video, just like you mentioned, it is a lonely place to not be able to be transparent and to share. And so, you know, that's another why. Okay, to answer your question, you mentioned earlier about the COVID situation now, and you know the almost unimaginable stress factor of whether or not you have one of these on or you don't. It's almost indescribable to me how much pressure that creates to wear a mask or not to wear a mask. I've had pastors say, I don't understand why somebody will wear a mask in the grocery store, but they won't wear it into my church. And the factor of, you know, I've heard this story at 9 a.m., the phone call rings and there's a guy screaming at the pastor. So I can't believe we're thinking about having services this Sunday, or why would we do that? This is so dangerous. We shouldn't do it. And he has to politely and politically, you know, listen to the concerns and share where they're at. And at 10 o'clock, an hour later, the phone call rings and it's, Pastor, why aren't we back together? This is ridiculous. We should not be falling in. This is the ways of the world. We're being led by sheep to the slaughterhouse, and you know the whole other extreme. And he does the same thing. And an hour later, gets another phone call from and it's like a ping pong ball back and forth. Some of that is starting to subside right now, But doing that day after day after day, it takes a toll on you, and you don't know where to turn. You don't have the answer. You've never been faced with that stuff before. Seminary didn't prepare you to how to politically and properly appease people and still make everyone love the Lord at the same time, or offer that. So that's one of those things that came into play. The other whys are, we all expect our pastors to be there to meet our needs. Okay, one of the again, not to jump ahead, but we do these pray for your pastor tours that you're familiar with. A few years ago, we stopped at a church in the western side of the state just to visit with that pastor, and we came out and said, "Hey, Pastor, we just want to pray for you, ask for God's blessing on your ministry." We had some gifts for him, and the guy broke down. It was a large church. The guy broke down in tears, and he said, "In 35 years, no one has ever come onto this property to pray for me. 35 years. It's always been the other way around." And so why does that matter? Well, we actually believe that prayer matters in our ministry. We believe that our prayers somehow mysteriously go into buckets of time and space and move the hand of the Lord, especially prayers of protection and of provision and of empowering and promoting the gospel. These things matter. And so that's another one of the whys. Go ahead. Did you want to cut me off there? Or
No,
no?
I'm just saying
Okay.
you're right all day long. When you said, 7, it takes 7
Oh,
positive things to negate one negative thing. It's like, I've
yeah.
been in ministry
So,
30 years, and it's
well, so
it's
let
20
me
to
give
1
you
it's flipped the other way.
let me give you one other why that just came to my mind, and I mentioned earlier about the power of our words. God uses all kinds of different personalities to present his word, right? I mean, goodness gracious, he's using you and me in ways that we probably would have never imagined. And we've got just as many flaws and problems as the next guy. But early on in our ministry, we were hosting a retreat, and it was for a very well-known, internationally known pastor. And something happened on that retreat that brought out the worst in this guy. And he was angry and he was upset, and it turned into a litigation scenario. And I remember that very traumatizing time for me. I was right in the middle of it at that point. And I said, "God, why do you use people like that?" And I remember almost like he was tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Andy, I have no choice but to use flawed and sinful people to accomplish my work on the earth." And that stuck with me. And it's given me a new level of compassion that I didn't have 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And I see it in, for whatever reason that God calls the people that he does. I'm thinking of a scenario that just in the last year, a fairly new lead pastor, first time in a lead pastor position. He's rather young. He's a little rough around the edges. An excellent expositor of the word, an excellent preacher, but he doesn't have every gift of the Spirit, to full capacity, I should say.
Mhm.
And so watching that dynamic, as well as understanding the dynamic that the devil is always at work also, I was watching some interaction between him and another staff member. The other staff member has kids that are sort of coming back to the Lord, they're sort of just watching, but also sort of looking for a reason not to come back to the Lord. Okay, like where I'm at in that scenario.
Mhm.
And so what happens is this young lead pastor who's enthusiastic, energetic, doesn't really like the methods of this older guy that has problems in his home. That pastor comes home, sits at the dinner table, talks about pressures at work, and what happens is the kids are watching, and all of a sudden, there's the reason that they shouldn't get back involved with the church. Things are going well, and so this pastor, young guy, thinks he's doing the right thing, thinks he's leading and instructing in righteousness, but what's happened is it's creating a dynamic here, and at home, it's creating another opportunity to send these kids running away from the Lord. I've seen it happen over and over again. And so what we say the power of our words, James tells us that the power of death and life is in the tongue right there. And we say things that decades later will be resurfaced. So if I have an immediate encouragement to somebody listening, guard your heart, guard your words like they are gold, because whatever you say gets trickled down from, it gets twisted, it gets trickled down, and it impacts, the ripple effect of impact can reach generations later. It works both ways. So be encouraging with your voice, be encouraging in your prayers. Understand that your prayer, all right, I'm getting sidetracked out of the way.
All right. Well, we're going to switch gears.
Okay.
And I want to remind folks as we get into the how, if you got questions about the how, we could talk all night about the why. But for the rest of our time, we want to talk just about practical ways about the how. And I mean, from what you just said, Andy, I would ask everybody that's watching this webinar, either live or after the fact, someday in the future, when's the last time you looked in the eye and said, "You're doing a good job. This has been a tough year. You're doing a good job. Thank you for sticking with it." Because they need to hear that 7 and 1 for the 1 negative. They need to hear positive 7 times, and they have not that last year. That in the last most practical is have look to your pastor in the eye and say, "Good job. This last year, good job. You weren't trained for this in seminary, but you've been leading us well." So, but Andy, you talked about prayer. I want to get into this first before we get into some of the more physical, practical ways that we might support our pastors. But would you talk about how that's important and a big part of your ministry?
Yeah, so I don't have a copy of it here, but we give out a book. It's called Prayer Shield, and it's by Peter Fuller. It was written years ago, but and again, I wish I could show you the decor in my office that reminds us about that. But one of the things he says is, in any given church, if you got 100 members in your church, one of those members is a demon. And I know there's people that aren't comfortable talking about spiritual warfare, maybe to the level that we could get to. So we'll try and not get too deep into it. But he said that same percentage basically goes up as your church scales. And that, from my experience, that is a very real statement right there, that there are constantly people and circumstances all across the map that the enemy is using to derail there. So we are believers in the power of prayer. I personally believe that our prayers are timeless. And I can give you a couple of examples of where I feel like even today that I personally am living out the prayers of my parents, grandparents, perhaps people generations before me. It doesn't happen every day, but there are some times that I absolutely acknowledge it, and it reminds me of the opportunity that God's given us to travel the nation talking about the power of prayer and the expectation of it. I'm a believer that you have to expect that when you're asking as the Spirit leads you, that your prayers are fervent and effective. It's what the Bible tells us, and we believe it. We've seen it. We hear stories of people that say, "I know that you were praying for me today," or "I know that this was prevented," or, it's easy to tie physical things that happen, the scenario of, "Hey, I wasn't in this car accident because someone was praying." I mean, that's all probably all realistic also, but we know that there is protection that happens. Protection in marriages, protection in ministry circumstances, protection in making decisions one way or the other. We know that happens as the result of our prayers. There's a wall in our office, we call it the God wall right there. And it's a chalkboard wall. It's about 10 feet long, and it's completely filled up with moments that we cannot explain any other way other than seeing the breath and the fingerprints of God show up. When that happens across the board, it from the beginning of the time the Israelites would see God do absolute miracles, and they would just plain forget the next day, and they'd be complaining about provision or something that's going on. We're the same way. We can see God do extraordinary things and we forget. So, what am I saying? I'm challenging you as a pastor or a lay leader, write down the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, the things that you know are results of prayers that you've prayed or that you're praying for. And I used to think that, prayer was a almost an intangible thing that you can't really quantify, but you start writing down and putting on display the results of your prayers, and you will become a believer in that you absolutely can quantify and you can reconcile the value of your prayers to what's happening in the physical realm that we live in day to day. Yes, so prayer is important. It matters. Regular, consistent prayer, you can't get enough of it. And you should believe what the Bible tells us, that it is the most powerful tool that we have. It's hard. Prayer is a lonely ministry, but I absolutely believe it's the most powerful, effective tool that we have as a Christian.
Yeah, something happened for us this week. Not only the spiritual covering that our leaders have because we pray for them, but also the encouragement they receive when they know we're praying for them. It's not exactly one of our pastors, but at breakfast every morning, one of our kids is still in school, and so for breakfast we have a little devotion and a prayer, and we pray for the staff of our church and for his teachers practically every morning by name. And one of my son's teachers emailed us this past week about that. And my wife said in reply something, and she said, I want you to know we're praying for you by name in the mornings. And so I don't know what kind of wind that put into his sails. And he replied back, thank you very much for your prayers. But for pastors, it's one thing to pray for them. And because that elicits the power of God that they don't understand, that is now covering them and protecting them and sustaining them, but also the encouragement that you need to look your pastor in the eye and say, do you know that I'm praying for you? I'm praying for you in the, at breakfast, or I'm praying for you while you're preaching, or where. And now you have to be honest. You can't be lying about prayer. Is there anything worse than lying about praying? But it's saying you got to pray for your pastor, and then tell your pastor, do you know that my family prays for you every fill in the blank, whatever it is, because they don't know that, and you may be praying for them, and they're receiving the spiritual covering that comes from that. But the encouragement side of that is huge. If you would begin to pray for your pastor regularly, and then number two, tell them, you need to know that every Friday morning I'm praying for you, or text them, pray for you while I'm driving to work, or whatever it is. So it makes me
I think if you have access to the cell phone for your pastor, the text, or through email, or the old-fashioned handwritten kind, when you let them know, and honestly, Tim, like I don't think there's ever a day when I ask the Lord to prompt me to do something for him that day. I don't think there's ever a day that I will not get some sort of a prompting or a nudging of, hey, this is what I should do. And if you ask for those opportunities, like prompt me to pray for my pastor, we send a text out every day at lunchtime that you can sign up for right now that sends a way to pray for your pastor. But when that happens, believe me, you will get positive reinforcement. You'll be encouraged yourself and refreshed yourself, because your pastor will let you know the impact of that.
Yeah. Well, why don't we get into the more practical side of just some simple things. You take guys out on a day retreat and they're on ATVs or whatever, but we've got about 10 minutes left. Just talk about as many bullet things as we can talk about that just really make a difference in your pastor feeling healthy and engaged and excited about moving on in ministry.
Yeah, so I'll do a couple of things. So as our ministry has grown, so has our calling of God, that we do provide direct encouragement, refreshment, and recreational outings to pastors. You see me swinging my empty coffee cup around here. I know I spend a lot of my time one-on-one having coffee with a local pastor. It's what we say, when I use the word unencumbered recreation, it is a time where I and the other guys that work in our ministry have built, it takes a little time, but have built a platform of trust, of confidentiality with other local pastors, that they know they can sit down, we can share coffee together, maybe a donut sometimes, but we will share where there's no expectation and it's non-judgmental. So while that side of our ministry has grown, so has the ability for us to encourage other people with, just like you said, tangible, practical ways of how to be giving back. We do a lot of radio. We do these Energize Your Pastor contests that you know about. And I will often say, maybe you're driving down the road right now and you're in the minivan with two kids in the back seat, and the Lord's just prompting you to be that voice of encouragement to your pastor. Stop by with a Starbucks gift card. Stop by with a chocolate chip cookie. Some little thing that will absolutely brighten their day in the midst of something that you may not even know what's going on, right? Most battles are unaware to those around us. So our ministry exists to help people that are watching right now, to help you guys. We do that daily through social media. Where there's not just ours, but there's a lot of websites that you can get on, or Facebook pages that will send you daily ways to encourage your pastor. Simple, practical things. Okay. We do from our ministry.
Let me interrupt you.
Yeah.
Let me interrupt you and remind our folks that I'm going to have links to your sign up for your text in the follow-up email tomorrow, and the book that you referred to, I'll have a link to that book as well.
Yeah, that's one of the best, actually, the Prayer Shield book. If I'll throw in another one too, just if you're a pastor watching here, Leadership Endurance is another book that we give out. Not how to be a great leader, not how to do it, but how to endure through leadership right there. It's by Brian Sanders. But anyway, we do a lot of like advocating right there for pastors through our newsletters. We give out the Pray for Your Pastor stickers, like all the little paraphernalia stuff. But the prayer support, you mentioned that, the encouragement, the one-on-one time, it's I would say where our ministry's roots are in recreational retreats, that is something that we preach to churches right there. So if you're leadership right now, we are advocates of quarterly retreats. And when I say quarterly, there'll be 4 of them throughout the year. One would be an individual, even if it's a one-day retreat for your pastor. What's something he likes to do? Does he like to fish? Does he like to go race go-karts? Does he like to go skeet shooting or golfing? Does he like to sit in a hammock and read a book at the beach? Whatever that is, let's just call it first quarter, set up a retreat. You don't even have to know about it. Just say, Pastor, hey, we want to send you away to do X right here. It may be rock climbing or rappelling, I don't know, whatever it is. So there's always something. But just send them out for a break. Second quarter, if your pastor's married, send him and the spouse out. Send them out for a date night right there, or some kind of overnight retreat. Get a hotel room for them. Third quarter, if the pastor has children, send them on a family little retreat. Maybe it's the Great Wolf Lodge if they have young kids. Maybe it's, I don't know, a mountain cabin on the ski slope in the wintertime. But send their family as the church. Said, Pastor, we want to bless you. Third quarter, this is your family retreat. And then fourth quarter, or the other part of that would be a staff retreat if the church or organization is large enough for a staff. It's absolutely vital to have fun recreation time in your staff. It's great for team building. I know you guys are world class at that, but that is something that we're missing right now. The ministry is pressure, 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 and you need a break from it. You need a physical break to do something fun, to join, to get together, to share with each other. So what does that do? Basically, everybody has something to look forward to every 45 days. You got 45 days in between, and every 45 days you're reflecting back. And people reflect back on things for years. And we hear it now. We hear people say, remember that day you took us to the lake and we did the water skiing trip, or whatever. It's reminders of, hey, somebody cares about me. My church loves me. They're taking care of me. That is a blessing that will yield dividends, not just today, tomorrow, but years down the road.
I'm going to interrupt you right there and just add on to that a little bit. I would recommend, if you don't already know, when is your preacher's anniversary? 2 anniversaries: anniversary of his employment of leading your church, but more important, his marriage anniversary. Nobody in the church knows that. You need to know when their anniversary is, and you send them away, you pay for it. And then the second thing I would say on the how is, if your pastor has been there for an extended period of time, you need to initiate the conversation of a sabbatical among your leadership. I I,
Absolutely.
I have talked to I did a webinar a couple months ago about effective elder meetings, but one of the elements of an effective elder meeting is shepherding your pastor. So I gave some tips on that. But what I talked about was that I've had like 5 friends that have gone on a sabbatical in the last 3, 4 years, an extended sabbatical of 8 to 13 weeks. And I called all of them back and said, who started that conversation? And all 5 of them said, I had to tell my leaders
Mm.
I need a break. None of them did the leaders say, we want you to take a break. And these guys have been in ministry 10, 15, 20 years without an extended break from ministry. And so anniversary and sabbaticals are huge to say, we want you healthy to lead our church.
Yeah, I want to emphasize what you just said right there too, because it is almost tragic that people do not understand how important that is. And I'll give you another story. Okay, a few years ago, we spent a great deal of time mitigating, counseling, trying to repair some damage from a pastor that was crying out and said, "Guys, I need a break." Okay, he said, "I'm burned out. I need a break," and it fell on deaf ears right there. One day, the pastor's at Lowe's hardware store picking up some stuff for the church. And you know what? He forgot his wallet and he needed some dog food or something, and he put it on the church credit card. And it was very simple explanation. I'm not saying this is right by any means. I'm saying I understand it. He says, you know what? They don't really care about me right now anyway. It's not a big deal. It's $2 for dog food. But the next week, you know what happens? Something else happened. And 2 years later, and $21,000 later, this pastor went to jail for embezzlement. You know why that happened? Because he needed a break, and people weren't listening. My lead pastor right there that hung himself from the balcony in his own home needed to be able to say, guys, I need some help right now. And there is such a wall and barrier of people not understanding that Satan is after our leadership, and it's our job, just like you gave the example of the Levites in the Old Testament, to reach back in and pour back in. These things are wrong that happen. We all know that. Okay. I'm not making light of it or justifying. I'm telling you, these are what's happening when we are not pouring back into and investing and refilling the lives of our leadership. And nobody is exempt from it. It's happening right under your noses, and we're not aware of it right there. And I don't like to get upset and preach about that, because I do like to have fun. I do want to do the recreational and offer those things, and we're good at it, and God's given us the ability to do it. But I never forget that the reason we do these things is because of the intensities of the battle that's facing any advance of the gospel.
Yeah, if you remember Moses leading God's people, and then Aaron and Hur, as he had his hands up, but when his hands came down, they started losing. And it took 2 guys next to him holding his arms up. He was the leader, but it took 2 of God's people to stand right next to him, hold his arms up, so that God's people could win. And man, what a metaphor for your pastor needing 2 people to come alongside him and hold his arms up during this battle that we're in. And so, yeah, you sat up in your chair and you started preaching at us right there. Give us a couple more things to kind of finish up that you've seen recently.
Well, some of these things
you've seen churches do.
Seem to be so elementary, but I do want to make sure I mention the marriage counseling thing again. I think that's so important. It may look like maybe your pastor even will be honest and say, my marriage is great, but a little tune-up doesn't hurt anybody right there. Mm-hmm. I have an old Jeep, and every once in a while that thing starts missing a little bit, and it needs a new spark plug in it or a new set of wires or something, and it's worth it because I want to take care of that Jeep. Well, things get out of step. You remember the enemy's right there, like leaning, pushing, and so I really do say that should be a mandatory part or part of the package, right? Your pastor has a compensation package. That should be part of it right there. I want to mention what you said about the anniversaries, the birthdays. This may not seem like a big deal, but what does a great job of running through birthdays is Facebook. Okay, Facebook will tell you when it's somebody's birthday. And you go to any one of those pages and there's 60, I don't know, 60, 100 people sometimes, maybe 20 people, but nobody gets through their birthday without an acknowledgement from Facebook. And you know what? It makes you feel good because you hear from people that you haven't talked to in years sometimes. Maybe you don't ever talk to them until the year before when they said happy birthday to you, but it
Mhm.
makes you feel good and it lifts your spirits a little bit. So I agree. Know your pastor's birthdays. Know the birthdays of their kids. Remind them that they're important. I went for years not really recognizing that there's little people running around too, right? I had my friends and buddies and I didn't even know some of their kids' names. But when I go back and I say, hey, you know, how's Beth doing? Or how's Miley or Kylie or whoever the little ones are? It matters because you're showing interest in their life. And it's a two-way relationship. It's not, hey, Pastor, we expect this from you. We expect you to do this, this, and this. And by the way, that's all we care about. It doesn't work like that. Pastors are human. We have testimonies on the wall behind me of people begging and saying, we're not superheroes. We have needs also. Thank you for what you do. So this is, again, this is all practical stuff. You know, the babysitting, send them a car wash gift card. I like to have my car clean. If somebody would give me a car wash gift card, I'd be jumping for joy. So maybe that's just something in a little thank you note. We have, I can't reach them from where I'm at, but we have thank you notes that we give out to people with just practical ways. Pastor, we appreciate what you're doing. Here's how your sermon impacted my life this week. Like, not just, hey, that was a great sermon, but share an example. Here's what I did as a result, because pastors everywhere have no idea what's really connecting with people. They can sit up there, preach their heart out, do exactly what the Lord asked them to do, but it's not like a carpenter where you know the house is finished or your car's fixed at the mechanic. You don't really know how it's connecting with people, and they need that feedback, not just ego affirmation, just to recognize, hey, you know what? This thrills me that God's speaking through my pulpit right here to reach these people. And here's what's happening as it. So share those stories. Stories are powerful. Positive stories are powerful. I have the other end where I could tell you the music pastor we held a retreat for a few weeks ago, reading us one of the note cards and says, why do we have to have that saxophone in here? Sounds like a nightclub in this place. Okay. Maybe you don't like the saxophone, but it's okay. You know, just like anything that you can do to be a positive reinforcement, even if it makes you uncomfortable, it absolutely matters. And you will be the recipient of that because of your obedience.
Well, we're about out of time, Andy. Boy, we could talk about this all night, couldn't we?
We could. I'm just getting
We're
going.
going to have to. Yeah, I know you're just getting started. I think I don't want to leave out, for those that are listening or will watch us later, it's not only your pastor, but it's his wife and his family. And at Waypoint, we've recently started for our church planters. We've got someone on staff just in the last 2 years who's our planting wives care, because we don't have enough data points to understand it. But for the church planters that don't have a long ministry in their church plant, more often it's because of the wife's discontent with the way things are going, not the guy. The guy's got his head down, working hard, but the wife needs to be pastored. Who's pastoring the pastor's wife? And in most churches, it's nobody. And so that would be a huge thing as well. And we've delved into that a little bit. But to ask, and I know we had Rex, my friend Rex is on tonight. And so he would know from the church that I pastored in Richmond a few years ago, that there were 3 or 4 ladies at our church that if someone was going to complain about my wife, they were ready to rumble. I mean, they had her back, and she knew they had her back, and that she was not alone at that church, and that they would have to go through those ladies to get to her, you know, that kind of deal. And so what an encouragement in ministry for the preacher's wife to know that there was a group of gals that were surrounding her physically if needed, but emotionally and spiritually, for her to stay engaged in ministry with full enthusiasm. And so how can you strategize about not only encouraging your pastor, but his wife and the kids? And how can you be those that are holding up their arms while they're doing God's work in the battle that we're in? Well, our time is up. Man, we could go on, but we thank you all that are on this webinar tonight, that you've got even an interest in this conversation. And we hope that it's not just you, but it's you creating a group of people at your church that value and strategize, how can we pastor our pastors. Pastors church where they were ordained back in Ohio 30 years ago are not pastoring your pastor. They've forgotten that they ordained him 30 years ago. There's nobody pastoring your pastor other than you. And so find some people to do it and start tomorrow, maybe even tonight with a text and say, hey, prayed for you tonight. We're behind you. Well, Andy, thanks for your encouragement tonight. And I'm going to have links to your website and those books that you referred to, and particularly the prompt text every lunch time to pray for your pastor, and other resources that your ministry provides for people just like us who want to um, blow wind in the sails of our pastors as we're navigating ministry.
Right.
And so thank you those of you who have been on the call tonight. I want to invite you to our webinar next month, which is about safety and security in your church. All the key points for protecting those that are 18 and under in your church. So it's not the auditorium, it's everywhere else but the auditorium, from a nationally known church security ministry. And so there's someone at your church, not you maybe, but someone at your church that needs to be part of that webinar next month. In the month of May, you'll see advertising for that. Well, Andy, thanks for your, not only your passion, but for your faithfulness in sitting right where you sit, that you said, I'll do this. Here am I, Lord, use me. And you are an encouragement to pastors all over the country from coast to coast. And what a powerful ministry you have just by saying, I'll do what you're asking me to do, Lord. So
Well,
thank you for your ministry.
yeah.
And we pray your blessing on you as you bless pastors.
Well, that goes both ways, Tim. Thank you for having me. And I liked your encouragement. We call it Be the One. That was the end of that video right there. You can be the one right now to be that voice of encouragement. So take it and run with it.
That's all it takes. All of you on tonight, you be the one. Text your pastor in the next 10 minutes. We'll see you on our next webinar, and have a great evening.